Welcome into the original Gangsters Patreon, members only. Today, I want to talk about a kind of a hidden wrinkle, I guess you could say, in the Gotti legacy and the Gambino crime family, and tie it into something that happened recently, and then give some insight that I'm 99% sure has never been made public. I definitely have never put it out there. It's something I kind of just found out recently from some of my sources, but that will be kind of the real exclusive aspect of this video. So last week, Mark Reiter, the former Gambino drug kingpin, Jewish mob associate connected to the Gotti crew, picture of surveillance photo of him there, I believe in 1985 or 86, passed away in prison of stomach cancer. He was 76 and had been locked up since 1988. Very, very big earner for the Gotti drug wing that we all know caused a lot of problems for him with Paul Castellano in the early 80s, and in a lot of ways prompted the move on Castellano from the Gotti faction. And I guess I didn't realize how much of a major player Mark Reiter was in all that. Not that I didn't realize that he was involved, but I didn't realize what a central figure he was in the Gotti's drug activities. And specifically, and if you go hit Gangster Report, our companion web magazine, I'll tell you another kind of hidden story throughout LCN history is we all know when we talk about the Harlem drug trade, Nicky Barnes, Frank Lucas, Guy Fisher. I think the first name that comes to anybody's mind is Matty Madonna, the future Lucchese boss who was supplying a big part of Harlem. The Lucchese's and the Genovese were doing most of the supplying in the 70s. But by the 1980s, the Lucchese and the Genovese, not to say that they lost a presence in Harlem, but the biggest LCN wholesale supply presence in Harlem was the Gambinos. Through Mark Reiter, they took over the old Nicky Barnes crew with the help of Nicky Barnes. Reiter was a protege of Herbie Sperling, legendary Jewish gangster who was locked up with Nicky Barnes and linked Nicky Barnes with Mark Reiter and the Gambinos and all that territory in Harlem in 80, 81, 82, 83, 84 was being flooded with heroin by Reiter, Angie Ruggiero, Sal Ruggiero, Tony Roach, Rampino, guys that were very close to John Gotti. And then 83, a case hits, and there are tapes, and Castellano is figuring out what's going on. All that was Mark Reiter. So Reiter gets indicted in 87 when the front man, I guess, for the Gambinos' drug operations in Harlem, a guy named James Jackson, who was working with a lot of Barnes's former lieutenants, but was kind of put out in front as a lightning rod, even though he had no history in the drug game or history with Barnes's guy. He was a bank robber that met a lot of Barnes's guys in prison. James Jackson, they called him Applejack, and he flipped, and that led to Nicky Barnes flipped as well. That led to Mark Reiter, as well as a number of other Gambinos being incarcerated. That brings us to what we want to talk about today. I know that was a long preamble, but Mark Reiter's son, Greg, right after Mark was convicted and sentenced to life in prison in 1988, began being edged out of all the racketeering and drug activity that he was involved in on behalf of his dad, with his dad off the streets. Greg Reiter was a contemporary of John Gotti Jr., who, was a made guy, eventually would have his own crew, and was known to have this kind of wild entourage that, hit clubs, and there were a lot of bar fights, and in some cases, some murders and stabbings. And Greg Reiter was a part of this Junior Gotti entourage, inner circle. And he was doing some drug dealing separate from his dad. He was dealing more marijuana for the younger guys. And the Gotti Jr. crew was kind of in tandem with Bonnano's out of Brooklyn, and moving a lot of marijuana weight up from Arizona and Texas to sell on the streets of New York. As Greg Reiter is being edged out, he is not quiet. Greg was somebody that dressed very flamboyantly, talked very loudly, rode his dad's reputation. And his dad wasn't really like that. His dad was a little bit more quieter, even though he was somebody that liked to dress very well and drive very expensive cars and wear a lot of jewelry. In terms of his mouth, he was not known as mouthy or subversive. Greg, when he's being edged out and his dad can't really do anything, or his dad's trying to do anything, or trying to do something he can't, Greg is very vocal at his anger, that because his dad's no longer on the street, he can't earn anymore. He's essentially bad-mouthing Junior Gotti and the guys in the Bonnanos who were taking over his old territory. And the main guy in the Bonnanos that was at the tip of the spear was Tommy Karate, Thomas Patera, Brooklyn Capo, eventually a skipper, a guy with dozens of bodies, a guy whose name goes to his love of martial arts. He studied in Japan under some prominent karate instructors, and came back to the United States and got into the Mafia. So we know, we're pretty certain that Tommy Karate killed Greg Reiter. That Greg Reiter was called to a meeting, a sit down, if you will, to presumably iron out some of these turf issues. And before he knew what was going on, Tommy Patera allegedly took a shotgun and shotgunned him to death. Then it was in Nassau County in a parking lot. They then took him to a wildlife preserve in Nassau County. They chopped the body up. They put him in different suitcases and dropped them in Queens. Mark Reiter was beside himself, angry. Obviously, this was his son. And there was a lot of questions about where this came from. Was this Tommy Karate acting on his own? Did he have sanctioning? Well, there's two things I'm going to tell you. First, this is something that's already known, that two of the three conspirators in that murder were murdered in the years to come as vengeance exacted by Mark Reiter for the murder of Greg. Mike Harrigan, who was Tommy Karate's point man with the marijuana distribution ring, and Billy Bright, who was one of Tommy's drivers and was driving the getaway car on the day of the murder. They were both killed. Harrigan was killed in 91, and Billy Bright was killed in prison by the Aryan Brotherhood, allegedly on contract taken out by Mark Reiter, which is interesting that a Jew would go to neo-Nazis, if you will, to carry out murder contracts. But that's how you roll in the underworld, where everybody can kind of put their biases aside if it's for the sake of money, power, vengeance. So this is the part that my sources have told me that I haven't reported it. I've never seen it reported. Tommy Patera was not convicted of that murder. He's been convicted of others and is doing life sentence. He was actually convicted of killing Willie Boy Johnson, who was one of John Gotti's enforcers who had turned informant, had been an informant for a long time, was outed, and did that as a favor to Gotti. So what I'm about to say, it might be controversial, but I've been told this, and I believe this on really good authority, that Greg Reiter's murder was sanctioned by the Gottis. Not exactly certain if it came from senior or junior, but it didn't matter that Mark Reiter was their friend or their business associate. He was Jewish. That's always going to play a role in the mafia. If you're a Jew, I don't care how popular you are, unless you're Meyer Lansky, you're always going to be on the outside looking in when it comes to fallout. So Mark Reiter, even though he had made all this money for the Gottis and the Gambinos, when he went away, they didn't really care about him anymore. They might have given him lip service. But when Greg Reiter started to disrupt their business and started to badmouth Gotti Jr. on the streets, this wasn't Tommy Karate taking up a cause by himself. He was told he could do this, and he was spared. He was a made guy. He was spared. But the two guys that he used as setup men and a getaway driver, Mark Reiter was allowed to get his pound of flesh. So this is an interesting story, and I thought people should know that another example kind of exemplifies the way the mafia is. Nobody's your friend. Business always comes first. And sometimes it can get really personal. Like in this case, they killed Mark Reiter's son. Somebody had made them millions and millions of dollars. So thought that was interesting. Mark Reiter dead at 76. Greg Reiter's been dead now for 35 years. But I think I just shed some light on circumstances around his execution. Scott Burnstein, check back. We have more content coming this week on Patreon members only. Please check out the YouTube. Check out our companion Gangster Report web magazine. I'll see you next time. Scott Burnstein, I'm out.